Now, before we get started on today's webinar, Zeus and the Boys, a book written by our own George Pawlush, it is my pleasure and my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Gregg Camps, the new president of Wilkes University. Dr. Camps has been with us for less than a month, but long before he formally arrived on campus, he was spotted at several Wilkes athletic events. He's also been spotted touring around town and hiking around northeastern Pennsylvania. I suspect we will see him out and about more often than not. Dr. Camps has more than 30 years of experience as an educator and administrator in the United States and abroad. Most recently, he served as the dean of the Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State University. As dean, he provided strategic leadership for a business school of over 3,700, which is considerably larger than our entire Wilkes University undergraduate program. He's held positions as a faculty member, as an administrator, a faculty leader, department chair, academic dean at 3 research-intensive universities, a regional state university, and a selective private liberal arts college. He also served as a professor in China. He worked in the UK as well as his native Australia. With that wealth of experience, you can understand why we feel very fortunate and believe Dr. Camps is just what we need during these unprecedented times. So welcome to Dr. Camps. Dr. Camps.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to join you today and to hear from George. On a very personal note, I'm disappointed on behalf of all of us, George, that we didn't get to do our original plan, which I think was to actually have a proper book launch on campus. It's a great story. I'm very excited to participate with everyone else, and George has been a great friend and supporter of Wilkes for a long time. So like everyone else, I'm excited to listen to the insights that George was able to garner after talking to so many people about this important part of the history of Wilkes. And as I was saying, sort of joking around before we began, I think any era that includes the word, the concept of hordes is worth understanding. And I think one of the great lessons of life is always be on the side of the horde. So I'd love to turn it over to George and hear about his great journey in this book and what he learned and he can share with all of us. But thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Camps. Let's get started with our webinar. Today is extra special for all of us who appreciate the historic fabric of Wilkes University, including our commitment to athletics. There's many stories to tell to turn us into the institution we are today. But today we are focusing on one bright light from our past, the era of Coach Rollie, Schmidt, and the football phenomenon of the late 60s. A very special welcome to my friend Dave Jolly. I want to thank you for your assistance today, and to our own George Pawlush, thank you. George is a member of our Board of Trustees and a steadfast supporter. Now let me introduce my colleague Mary Simmons, our Associate Director of Alumni Relations. She's going to share some housekeeping items with you before we begin our conversation with George and Dave.
Hi, as Margaret mentioned, I will be facilitating the webinar today, and I just have a few notes before we begin. All participants are in watch mode, but we do have the capability to be interactive, and we welcome your participation. So you may use the chat box at any point in time to drop your name, class year, and maybe even where you're from, so we can see who is here today. Additionally, if you have a question for George, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Those will be moderated as we go along. And now I would like to introduce our moderator and presenter for today. Dave Jolly worked with George as a student at Wilkes, and then he hired him at Geisinger. Dave recently retired after nearly 40 years as Vice President of Public Affairs at Geisinger. Dave has written or been the co-author of 4 books and worked with George reviewing and editing his minor league baseball book and this book, Zeus and the Boys. Dave and George have been friends for 45 years. So thank you and welcome to Dave as our moderator. And George, our Wilkes Board of Trustees member since 2008. He's spent 43 years as the Senior Public Relations Executive at higher education and healthcare institutions, first at Wilkes and then at Geisinger Wyoming Valley Medical Center, and hospitals in Connecticut, including Yale New Haven Hospital, Danbury Hospital, and Greenwich Hospital. Now retired, George has resided in Cheshire, Connecticut since 1982 with his wife, Carol. He is a member of the Football Writers of America, and he serves as chairman of the Society for American Baseball Research and the Minor League Research Committee. In 2018, he published his first book, Dawn and Dusk of the Colonial League, about a minor league baseball circuit that operated from 1947 to 1950 in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey cities. He has also co-authored a book entitled Jeff Bagwell in Connecticut. Bagwell, a Connecticut native, was inducted into Major League Baseball's Hall of Fame in 2017. George was also selected to the Connecticut American Legion Baseball Hall of Fame in 2019. George and Dave, take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and sort of start this conversation with George. And I know we want to get right into it, George. Everyone's been anticipating this book for quite a while, looking forward to it. You and I well know that it takes considerable work to write a book. So if you would, tell us a little bit about your motivation to write this book about Rollie, Schmidt, and Wilkes football.
Well, the motivation really, it was a lot of luck. Being a freshman in 1965, and when I came to Wilkes, the first thing I did is I joined the staff at the Beacon, and my first assignment was to cover the Wilkes football games. So I was there from the first game of 1965, and in my sophomore year, I began being the statistician for the football games, and then the Sunday Independent asked me to write up the games after the game. So that really started me off, and by the time I had graduated, I was pretty much doing all the writing about the football team, putting the brochures together. And when I graduated in 1969, I was appointed. I was the first full-time sports information director at Wilkes, and I continued doing that until about the mid part of the 1970s, when I became director of public relations. And then we had to depend upon students at that time to really cover the sports information director's job. But it was a lot of luck being entirely through that era. And once I left Wilkes, I went into healthcare, and for the next 40 or so years until I retired, I really focused on what I was doing, the healthcare. And finally, when I retired, I thought about getting back into writing again, and it's like going full circle. I started off with sports, I ended up with sports. So my ambition really was to write a book, and I had that opportunity with my first book about the Colonial League. It basically gave me an opportunity to talk about what life was like after World War II, what baseball was like after World War II, and what minor leagues. And I got to interview some people, but basically at that time, most of the people that had played in the league were in their 80s and 90s. So having finished that book, I came to the realization that what I really wanted to do was to write about Wilkes. And I wanted to interview a lot of people, because I think really that makes a book stand out. And so I got the idea, and that was 2.5 years ago. And I began writing, and after 2.5 years, I finally completed it this spring. So, it was like a long gestation there, but I think it was worth it. But I might add that my really motivation for writing this was really to honor Rollie Schmidt. He had a major impact on my life, and I think it played a major role in getting into what I made a career out of. So in addition to all the players who enjoyed those years. I was along with them. I didn't play on the team, but I was there and writing about it. And so it was really very satisfaction to me to write this book.
George, you mentioned interviews, and I know that you did many, many interviews for this book. Tell us a little bit about that and your process of the interviews and then moving through to the writing.
Well, the first step really was to do some research. And what I did was Wilkes has a archive center, and I spent a couple visits to the archive center. I spent some time at the Osterhout Library and the Luzerne County Historical Society. But I was really I aided in the fact that, one, all the beacons are on the internet through the library. And then there's, over the last couple of years, there is a internet site, newspapers.com, which basically had all the newspaper articles all the way back. So I really had a treasure of background information. And it was funny, when I went into looking at a lot of the articles in the Beacon, I saw my name there, and I could hardly remember that I wrote it, but I guess I wrote it. But anyway, after that, I began the interview process. And Mary she was great in helping me track down some of the addresses. And there are many addresses that were old, but I was able to get through 100 people. And these weren't all players. Some of them were coaches. Some of them were college personnel, trustees. There were a lot of people who were around that time who were very close to the team. And the interviews were really the biggest part of the job. I did 100 interviews, and each interview was averaged about an hour, about 1,200 words. So when I transcribed, I had over 120,000 words, which I really narrowed down for the book, probably around 10,000. But I had some great conversations. I'm very thankful to the players. Everybody was very frank with me. And I think the advantage I had was I knew pretty much all the guys that I was interviewing. But, they were very, as I said, they went through their lives. And at times I felt like a counselor, listening to the issues. And again, there are a lot of great stories, a lot of great successes. But for me, that was the most satisfying part of this whole project. And, as they became excited about the fact that I was going to be doing this, I got more excited. So it was really something that, I know they wanted to share with their families, their grandkids, and so on. I got pumped up for that. And so they really got me charged up. And I knew there was no way in the world that I wasn't going to finish the book. But it was, I put a lot of time in it, but it was well worth it.
When you and I talked, I know I mentioned to you that your endeavor reminded me of Roger Kahn with the Boys of Summer when he went and interviewed all the Brooklyn Dodgers. So I think that's kind of in that same vein. But let's get into Rollie a little bit. What made Rollie such an excellent coach? And talk a little bit about his philosophy of coaching.
Well, Rollie was totally different than many of the high school coaches at that time. He wasn't a yeller. He wasn't a screamer. He was very even-tempered. And, he had a lot of respect, first of all, for every player on the team, whether it be your star or the last 67th guy in the lineup. He had respect for everyone. I think that one of the biggest things for him was that he was very, very detail-oriented, and things that people wouldn't even think about. He was really into details. Practice, he had that all planned out. The whole practice was planned out. Preparation. In 1965, he began scouting the opponents, and with the film exchange. And what that was that his assistant coaches would go to to the game of their next week's opponent. And along the way, they would bring two of the films from their previous two games. So along with that, they would exchange with the next week's opponent, and the coaches would then go and scout that game and come back with the films from that team's previous two games. So that allowed Rollie to really put together a game plan. And many players told me that, they were totally prepared for every opponent that they played. And later on, Tony Cardinal told me that he was in Boston with a friend in the late 90s, and they ran into Steve Diassi. Now, Steve Diassi played for the Patriots and the New York Giants. And Tony showed Steve the plan, the plan for the coming week. And Steve had played at Boston College, and he said that was totally way far superior than the plans that they had at Boston College. But that was a key. The team was well prepared. They knew what they had to do, and they just performed.
That's great. Now, Rollie also coached golf. So did he have a similar approach to that sport?
Exactly. Rollie was practice, and it was nothing for him to go out on the golf course and just practice all his irons, all his woods. And he'd just go 2-3 hours practicing. Marvin Tini's told me that he went with Rollie to it was a high school football convention in Atlantic City, and Rollie took his club with him, and he started the morning taking 120 swings on his iron. So that is how he basically made himself better. He just practiced, and when he would go out and speak before large audiences, he would practice the speech for hours. Many of the coaches would just come off, and if they were giving a presentation, right off the top of their heads. But Rollie, again, practiced, and he wanted everything to be perfect. I remember also, as you talk about detail-oriented, one of the big things before the start of the season, we would take pictures of the team. And Rollie would get very much involved because he wanted the first row, the second row, everything to be perfectly placed. He wanted a perfect picture. And even with his assistant coaches, if they were taking a picture of the coaching staff, he would want, okay, he might be the only person wearing a whistle or a hat, and his assistants would be hatless and wouldn't have a whistle. And they would have one hand on their knee. Everything was orchestrated, and that's the type of guy he was. Very, very detail-oriented. But it worked. It worked, and he, again, during those years, he was probably one of the most successful coaches in the history of football.
Early in the book, you talk about the history of the Wyoming Valley and the anthracite region and the football culture locally, and how that played into the Wilkes football program.
Yeah, what football really got underway in the late 1880s, and actually Wyoming Seminary was the first local team to get into football. And early on, Wyoming Seminary played a lot of the freshman teams, major college teams. They played Lehigh and Penn State and so on. As far as high school football, Wilkes-Barre High School, which really covered the whole city, they had to go out of town to play because the smaller schools really couldn't compete with Wilkes-Barre High School. But in the 30s, they formed Wilkes-Barre High School was broken up into GAR and Myers, and at that time they formed a Wyoming Valley Conference and a West Side Conference. And football really, the golden era of high school football in the Valley was right after World War II, and it probably extended to the mid-'60s. And at that time, you had as many as 35 high school teams in the Valley, and unfortunately, what happened later on as you began to have the schools, consolidating, unfortunately, the amount of teams was reduced to probably 15 or 16, and so that's sort of it. The era ended in the 60s. Now, Wilkes and Kings both started football right after World War II, and their programs grew, but never really reaching the super success until 1965 for Wilkes, and that was really their 20th year. And now tying in with this is the Valley has a long tradition of anthracite coal mining, and for the miners and even when they were retired, these high school football games were big games, and the fans would meet at the local bars and travel in caravans to the game. And there were some of these games that attracted like 12,000 fans, and so it was very closely aligned with the coal mining industry. College coaches looked at players from the Valley as tough, well-disciplined guys. And so, a lot of guys who were recruited to play college ball from the Valley.
That's great. And I think I remember a story in the book of one of the players arriving late for practice because he had come straight from the coal mine. Well,
during that era, 1967, Wilkes had a player who was a miner, Roger Beatty. And Roger Beatty was a great great halfback in the 60s. But he had a job working in the mines, and he would come into practice with coal dust all over him. And as I talked to a lot of these Wilkes players from the 60s, they had fathers and grandfathers who worked in the mines, and many of them never really had an opportunity to graduate from high school. And so many of the guys in the 60s were the first of their generation to go to college. And again, many of them were supported by their parents who worked in blue-collar jobs, but they wanted their children to advance in the world.
That's great. We look at the panelist list. I know that we have a lot of those former players online with us today.
Yeah.
And I want to have you talk a little bit about the relationship that Rollie had with his players and some of the great stories that you heard and that you shared through this process.
Well, Rollie was a sort of unique guy, and he was a mystery to many. I think some people thought of him as of aloof and really not really personal and close, but he was totally opposite of that. He knew everything that was going on, and maybe he got some of that from Art Hoover and Ralston, but he knew a lot about everybody. And one story that really stood out, and Ron Grohowski, who unfortunately he finished his career with the 1964 season, so he didn't have a chance to be a part of that 1965 team. He told me, on a trip about 7-8 years ago to Florida, he ran into Rollie, and they talked about, what it was like, back in the 60s and so on. And 3 weeks later, Ron got a package from Rollie, and in it was a picture of him and 3 other football players who had been named to Who's Who. So Rollie kept things like that, and Ron was blown away because but that is what Rollie was like. He really was a caring individual. His success was based on the success of the people he coached, and not only the people he coached, but the people he thought and other people. I mean, he did a lot of things behind the scene. He was very selfless. He wasn't excited about being recognized. He just wanted to do the best job that he could possibly do.
Janine mentioned during your research, did you find any trait of Coach Schmidt's that surprised you?
That surprised me. I would say really how deeply he knew and how much he impacted a lot of the players. From personal stories that I got, there were some people that really had some issues during their playing days. And to some of these guys that he was a surrogate father and he filled that role. And they mentioned that without that, they wouldn't have been as successful in their life as they have been. That was, something that things I didn't know. I got to know him, but you never really got to completely know Rollie. You got bits and pieces because he really wasn't a kind of person that you would sit down with for an hour or 2 hours. Now, later in his career, he did spend some time, I know, with some of the people at Wilkes, some of the younger coaches. He spent a lot of time with them. But as far as during those years, not too many people had an opportunity to have long conversations with him.
Rollie had such a tremendous record at Wilkes, but if you look at his tenure, the Golden Horde, of course, with the winning streak, just drove the winning percentage way up. And then the team sort of leveled off later on in his tenure. Why would you think that would be? He was such a great coach.
Yeah, first of all, when you have a 37-3 record, everybody is gunning for you. And I think the biggest problem was the MAC. At that time, there wasn't a round-robin league. So what you had to do is you had to get a minimum of 5 MAC teams to play. Now, there are 20 MAC teams. But in 1970 and 71, Wilkes could not get 5 teams. So they were ineligible for the MAC championship. Because of that, Wilkes had to go up in competition. And, we were playing schools that are 4 or 5 times bigger than Wilkes, the Ithacas, the East Stroudsburgs, the Indiana State Universities. Those teams were really, and there were many of them of those teams offered scholarships. So to get a schedule together, certain years we played 5 independent teams. And, that was one of the issues, the competition we played. The other issue was during the early 70s, Wilkes enrollment really plummeted from like 2,500 to 2,000. And that had an unbelievable impact on the budget. So as a result, we were, budgets had to be cut. And
I imagine the flood must have been a factor in 1972.
It was. That was a factor. Also, the beginning of Title IX that ensured equal opportunity for female athletes. At that time, we only had 2 sports, field hockey and basketball. So, during the 70s, we added tennis, softball, and one other sport that doesn't come to mind right now. So again, with limited resources, that again cut into the budget. So while other schools in the MAC and a lot of our opponents were beginning to hire full-time coaches to recruit and had weight programs and so on, Wilkes, the only full-time person, actually wasn't full-time because he was teaching, was Rollie. So all our opponents, were gearing up their programs, and unfortunately we couldn't keep pace. So even with that, we still had, I would say, most of the 70s, even though we didn't have winning records after 1974, we were competitive. And, if you look at some of those seasons, a couple wins here and there, we could have had a winning record. But I think that, towards the end of his career at Wilkes, there was a lot of, bickering in the community. Rollie uses the same offense and everybody knows what's going to happen. And that was the reason, they felt that, some of the people felt that Rollie needed to adopt a new offense. Okay, so the next coach that came in completely went with a wide open offense. So instead of winning games 10-7, they were winning them 45-42, or it was mostly vice versa. And I think it was ironic when Joe DeMelfi took over the program in 1990, he adopted all Rollie's tactics as far as making your defense, putting your best athletes on defense, and resorting to the run. And again, it's not as exciting as being wide open, but it did shorten the game, and it was very successful for Joe DeMelfi. And actually, he got in the NCAA playoffs in 1993. So again, Rollie was not behind times as some people thought he was. He was there, and if you have a good offense and a good defense, good running offense. But I think another one of the issues that plagued Wilkes in the late 70s was really a quarterback. While Wilkes had some great quarterbacks early on in the streak, you had Rich Rochon, you had Rick Simonson, Joe Zukowski, Jeff Giberson, but there wasn't a dominant quarterback to take over in those last years, and that really hurt the offense.
Right.
But Rollie went with what he had. He designed his offense and defense around the talent that he had. Unfortunately, in the late 70s, a lot of the local players, Wilkes wasn't winning, and so we didn't get a lot of those local players. And that it all was sort of, talk about the team in 1965 when the team, everything happened to create that the gold streak. The same thing happened later on, but the opposite way. There were just so many different factors, but I don't think it was any Rollie coached the same way. I spoke with Eddie White, who was one of my student assistants in the 70s, and he told me that last year when Wilkes went 0-10, Rollie was even keeled. You couldn't tell the difference. I mean, he wanted to win. He was great with the media and so on. So he was a gentleman all the way.
Overall, a tremendous body of work. After Rollie retired from Wilkes, he sort of disappeared for a while, and we didn't see him. And then, of course, thankfully, Rollie and Marge returned to Wilkes as the school and a dedicated group of people raised awareness of his accomplishments and did the project to name Schmidt Stadium. Talk a little bit about how this effort got started, gained momentum, and actually became a reality.
Well, Rollie was a tenured professor, so he retired in 1994, and how it ended, how his coaching career ended, it wasn't really, there were no parties, there were no anything, and I think that he was really he was hurt by how everything unfolded. So when he left Wilkes, again. Here's a guy who had been part of the administration or part of the faculty for 32 years. There was no going away parties. There was nothing to honor what he had done at Wilkes. So for the next 14 years, he pretty much was aloof from the college, kept away from the college. And in 2007, actually, Sue Jolly, who worked in the development office, felt that, maybe it's time, that we really try to see if we can get him back involved with the college. And she went down with Mike Woods, who was the head of development at the time, and also Garth Jones. And so they came unannounced to Rollie's house and knocked at the door, not knowing what to expect. And, his first thoughts were, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to, But gradually, I think Sue and his wife got together, and I think they changed his mind. And they wanted to have, the whole basis was they wanted a reunion of the Golden Era people. But to have this reunion, they needed him there. So he consented. He came up. and he had a tremendous turnout of his former players. And based on that, Tony Cardinal and Bill Hanbury took the leadership role and organized a fundraising drive for the stadium improvement. So for about 2 or 3 years, they went and they Rollie participated in in discussions and so on, with meetings with former football players, and that group raised almost $1 million, and that provided the artificial turf and a lot of improvements. And in 2011, the stadium was named in his honor, and I think that Rollie, as I said before, Rollie was very, very selfless in he didn't expect or ever he didn't swim in all those honors, but I think the naming of that stadium was a perfect ending to it brought everything full circle. And I think he was so proud of that moment. And as the players came on the field with him, you could people, I wasn't there, but people told me what pride he had and the enthusiasm. Again, it came out of him, and again, I think all the dark days, I think, became bright days, and that was a big part of his life that day. With he and Marge were back on the field, and he realized that how much he was loved by his players and how much he was loved by a lot of the fans during that era.
Yes, and it's so nice now to see Schmidt Stadium, and of course the school has really upgraded the athletic complex surrounding it. So it's really a first-class facility now.
Well, in 1965, when Ralston Complex opened, it was sort of the top complex. And of course, in the 60s, 70s, everybody else, all the rest of the teams upgraded their facility. And it really, we didn't do anything to update that until the 90s when they added to the locker rooms. So that, we were behind at that point again, but, President Bryce at that time was able to put together a campaign, and they raised $1 million that expanded that facility. And that really helped the program. So from being, state of the art, we went the other way, but I think right now we have probably as nice a facility as a lot of our opponents do.
Great. Now we have a question from Barry Davenport. Can you speak to the relationships he had with his staff? I remember thinking Coach Gubick spoke in roly speak, meaning the trust Zeus had with each coach and the trust each coach had with him. Talk about that.
Well, I think that Rollie realized that, he had to give the coaches responsibility, and he had to back them up and let them coach their different areas. And, and he did. Jonah was with him for 20 years, and Jonah had different roles during that time. But he would go, and they knew what his philosophy was. They knew, how he coached and how he wanted his coaches to react with the players. He wanted his coaches after practice, after games, to meet with their areas and talk about things that could have been done better. One thing that Rollie, and I heard this so many times, never ever called out a player for not doing something right. He, even in film sessions, this one player told me that, he was going to punt the ball and decided that he was going to run with it, and unfortunately got tackled. So he went to the film session on Monday figuring, oh my God, I'm going to see this, and I know he's going to. So what happened right before the play on the film, Rollie he said, okay, we'll play the rest of it tomorrow at practice. So when he put the thing back on the next day, he advanced beyond the guy trying to make the the run instead of the punt. So again, he did not want to show up anybody on film and all that. And this was an example, his idea of that was, hey, he made a mistake. Why make anything bigger out of it? And he knew what mistake he made. And Rollie would, one of his things was his stare. He wouldn't yell at you, but he would stare. And you would know that he had some problems with you or with something like that. And it wasn't like players were scared of him or anything, but it turned out they didn't want to disappoint him. And that's how he coached. Players wanted to I'm sort of lost here.
Yeah, they all wanted to do well.
I guess bottom line was he treated people like he himself would like to be treated. And it's very simple. And a lot of players told me that in their careers, in their business, and they took a lot of what he did and they instituted their own management styles. And that it really, bottom line was, treat people like you would like to be treated. And a couple of people told me that. And it was and the thing too was, as far as winning, his philosophy is, if you've gone out there and put your total self in it and there was nothing left in the tank, that was winning in itself, even though you lost the game. So winning wasn't everything, but it was important that if you went and you lost, the fact that you lost, giving it your all, made you a winner. And that's what his feeling was. And his feeling really was, his players, once they finished college, what they were going to do in their lives. So he was all about lessons, things you learn on the football field, things you learn in class, that you learn from your mistakes, and you take this on in your life, and you become a better person. And he felt strong this is part of the educational process of lessons. And he was a lot about, teaching lessons.
You talk a lot about education throughout the book and about Rollie with teaching lessons. Talk a little bit, if you will, about the importance of athletes at the school doing well in the classroom as well as on the field.
Well, again, it fits in with learning lessons, and again, education came first. And you have to know, in some of those years that he coached, he may have only had half his team on the field at any one time, because, many of these guys were, had labs in the afternoon, and, they would maybe not show up for practice that day because they had labs. But, he realized they were in there to go to school and get an education, and sports was second. And I don't know too many coaches that I've ever met in my life that had that same philosophy. It was either football or nothing. But I mean, he realized that he was a part of that education process. And, that was the more important thing. It's what they did with their lives. And as I said before, it's remarkable. He somehow kept up with everyone, what they were doing in their lives. When he met them, that was the first question he would ask people, how are you doing and how did things go and so on. And, he followed everybody and was proud of everybody. And I think the last time I saw him was probably around 2011, 2012. And he came up to me and he said, how proud he was of me. That's like giving me $1 million, and that's all and that's what he did to a lot of people. He told you what he appreciated, what you did. And he was so proud of what you've accomplished in life. And I think that's what a lot of players remember. And Frank Sheptock mentioned it in following Rollie's death, the fact that, here it is, 50 years since they played for the guy, but still 50 years later, they still have a lot of respect and a lot of great memories of Rollie. And that is really a mark of a successful coach. And I think that says it all. When 50 years later, people still remember what he did and what he did for them and how much he meant in their lives.
That's for sure. For sure. Hey, that definitely comes through in your book, and we're running close on time. We're getting a little bit of time left, but tell us all how we can get a copy of your book.
Well, Amazon.com, and I self-published the book. I could have waited another 3-4 years to maybe get somebody to publish it, but most of us who are in the book or wrote the book are in our 70s and approaching 80. So I think it was important. I was excited to try to get this thing out as soon as possible. So I did publish through Amazon. And so if you go into Amazon and just put my name in there, it'll take you right to the page that has the book there. And I think right now it's like 5 days wait from the time you go in and you get it mailed right to your house.
Great. And
I'm hoping at some point in the future, in the fall, to get into Wilkes-Barre and maybe having a little event somewhere, and being able to talk to people, and because I know there are a number of the players have asked me, and I have a small supply of books to inscribe and autograph, which I'm honored to do, and so that's another source. But Amazon really would be the quickest way to go.
Well, we'll look forward to that event, and the folks can bring their books then, and you can sign them. Before I turn this back over to Mary, why don't you briefly tell us the Zeus story itself, since it's in the title of the book?
Yeah, that Zeus came into being in 1967. And, I talked to 2 or 3 people who told me about how it came about. And it was a day in October 1967. The players were going down the field. And at that time, they were practicing over at Artillery Park. So as they're coming down the steps, it's raining and it's sleeting. And everybody is, talking about how bad the weather is and why do we have to go out and play. And they didn't realize that in front of them, because they all had, their covers on and everything, Rollie heard them. And so he looked around and he pointed up into the sky and he said, "Stop." And the sun came out, the clouds parted, and the sun came out. And Mike Connolly says, "Who is this? It has to be Zeus." And from that point on, for the next couple of years, it was used in a lot of the articles. But again, as they say in the book, he wasn't a Greek god. He was a down-to-earth person who came about at a perfect time and led the school to its greatest athletic accomplishment, I think, ever. But that was sort of like they referred to him as Zeus, not to his face, but behind his back.
Well, he certainly made the sunshine at Wilkes football and throughout the school for a long, long time. I'm reading some of the group comments here. I don't know if you're busy talking, you might not be able to see them all, but great comments. Tony's mentioned how the alumni got so involved in the fundraising project, which was great. And a few of your folks are mentioning that they've received the book and they've started to read it, and others look forward to doing so. So I thank you for taking this time. It's a pleasure to talk about it and share with our Wilkes friends. And I'd ask Mary or Margaret or Gregg if there's anything in closing.
Well, before you do pass me on, I really want to thank you, Dave. You've been a true friend all these years, and Dave actually read the first edition of the script, where I was looking to him to say, do I need a lot more work into it? And he said, no, it's a go. And then later on, he with the final, when the final drafts were coming in, he took time to give it another read. And again, when you write a book and you're waiting for it to be published, you worry about anything that can go wrong. And that is something that Dave and I have experienced in our profession. You put together a big project, a printing project, and all of a sudden, it gets done, and then something appears that you've never caught before. So this was something that was probably 2 or 3 months that I spent just going over the final to make sure that everything was right. So again, Dave, thank you. And thank you, Mary, for all your help.
Well, my pleasure, George. And from the first read on, I said, you really have something here. And I'm so pleased to see that it's completed.
So am I.
I'll bet.
Your
Mary?
help as well, George. There was one last question in the chat. Do you think George knows if George Ralston really told the player on the field with a broken leg to get up because he was embarrassing him?
No, he didn't have a broken leg. He had the wind knocked out of him. And that was Ron Rosigno in 1957. So, I mean, he was down, but he wasn't out. But George did say that, whispered in his ear.
George, there's also another question from Jim Ungvarsky, class of 71, who was proud of the Lambert Trophy banners for football supremacy that they were hung in the old gym. He's wondering where the banners are now and if we can raise them once again.
Well, the issue was when Rollie left, a lot of the trophies and, the Lambert bowls were put in a closet somewhere. And it took like 10 years to find them. And Joe DeMelfi found a lot of it. But some of this stuff might have been lost in the flood because all these trophies were in the gymnasium on the main floor. So it could be very well the banners could have been destroyed. We did refurbish all the trophies. But again, when the new coach came aboard in